Loretta Washington was 58 years old when her daughter-in-law's open hand connected with her face in the kitchen of a house Loretta had paid off herself. Alone, after 31 years of building a career, raising a son, and turning 4 walls into something worth protecting. The slap landed hard enough to leave her cheek burning. But what burned longer was what came next. Dominique extending her palm and demanding Loretta's house keys, telling her they'd be adding their names to the deed by the end of the month. Dominique didn't look ashamed. She looked like a woman who believed she had already won. What she didn't know was that the for lease sign outside her own rental property had been posted 2 weeks before that slap ever landed. She had been planning this for over a year. What she hadn't planned for was who Loretta still had in her phone. 1 call, 11 minutes, and the woman who thought she'd already won was standing in handcuffs in Loretta's living room. But that was only the beginning of what Loretta had just set in motion. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from today. And if stories like this speak to you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story is even more intense. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, catching the soft clouds of flour that drifted up as Loretta sifted the dry ingredients for her sweet potato pound cake. The recipe was committed to memory after decades of making it for Calvin's birthdays, but she still kept the yellowed index card nearby. Her mother's handwriting a familiar comfort on Saturday mornings like this. Her brick house settled around her with the particular contentment of a space that had been carefully tended. Family photographs lined the hallway, telling the story of 30 years in freeze-framed moments. Calvin's graduation, his first job, the day she paid off the mortgage. The bookshelf she'd built herself during that determined weekend with YouTube tutorials and borrowed tools held her precious first editions, arranged by publication date. On the kitchen windowsill, African violets and pothos vines she'd nurtured for over a decade reached toward the morning light. The phone rang just as she was measuring vanilla extract. Paulette's name lit up the screen, and Loretta smiled, tucking the phone between her ear and shoulder as she continued working. "I was just thinking about you," Loretta said, her hands steady as she cracked eggs into the bowl. "Must be why my ears were burning." Paulette's warm voice filled the kitchen. "How's retirement treating you these days?" Loretta paused, considering. 8 months since she'd walked out of her office at the school district for the last time. 8 months of adjusting to days without the familiar structure of meetings and deadlines. Still getting used to it, she admitted. 31 years of waking up with a purpose. It's different now. Different doesn't mean worse, Paulette reminded her. Though I hear you're keeping plenty busy with those grandbabies. 3 days a week, Loretta confirmed, beginning to cream the butter and sugar. Saves Calvin and Dominique about $2,400 a month in childcare. She kept her voice neutral, though she couldn't help noting that neither of them had ever acknowledged that fact. "Speaking of Calvin," Paulette said carefully, "I tried calling the house last weekend when the kids were there. Dominique answered, said you were too busy to come to the phone." Loretta's hand stilled on the mixing bowl. "I was in the backyard with the children. Never knew you called." The silence between them held meaning. Loretta reached for her small notebook in the kitchen drawer, the one where she'd been recording things. Small things. Things that might mean nothing, or might mean everything. "He calls less," she said finally, writing the date at the top of a fresh page. "When he does, she's always there in the background. Always has somewhere they need to be, something they need to do." "Like last Sunday's dinner?" Paulette asked. "When they left before dessert?" "Mm-hmm." Loretta noted that too, her handwriting neat and precise. "And last month, when I went over on my regular Wednesday, the locks had been changed." "Changed?" "Calvin said it was a mix-up with the contractor. Had a new key for me by that afternoon." Loretta drew a small star next to this entry. "Funny thing is, I never saw any contractors at their house that week." She could hear Paulette shifting, probably sitting up straighter in her chair. "Loretta." "I know." Loretta continued mixing the batter, each stroke deliberate and smooth. "I see it, Paulette. I'm watching." "And you're writing it down?" "Every single thing." The batter was achieving the perfect consistency, glossy and thick. "My mama always said silence is how you hear what people aren't saying. So I'm being quiet, and I'm listening real careful." Through the window, she saw a car pull into her driveway. Calvin's silver sedan, a day early for their usual Sunday dinner. Dominique stepped out first, wearing a tailored dress that seemed too formal for a weekend morning. Calvin emerged more slowly, his usual easy smile nowhere to be seen. "They're here," Loretta told Paulette, watching as Dominique strode toward the front door with unusual purpose. Early, no kids, and Dominique's dressed like she's heading to court. "Want me to stay on the line?" "No need." Loretta's voice was calm as she watched Dominique enter, immediately beginning to move through the house with an air of evaluation, opening cabinet doors, running fingers along countertops, pausing in doorways as though taking measurements. Calvin followed, his discomfort visible in every line of his body. "I've got this recipe memorized by now." They both knew she wasn't talking about the cake. "Call me later," Paulette said firmly. "I will." Loretta hung up, set her phone aside, and continued preparing the cake batter as Dominique's footsteps echoed through her home, touching and assessing what didn't belong to her. In the living room, Calvin stood silent, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he used to do as a boy when he knew something wasn't right, but couldn't find the words to say so. The dinner plates had been cleared, and an uneasy silence settled over Loretta's dining room. The pot roast, tender as always, seasoned perfectly, sat heavy in their stomachs as Calvin retreated to the living room, his shoulders tense beneath his Sunday shirt. Dominique dabbed her lips with a napkin, placed it precisely beside her empty plate, and followed Loretta into the kitchen with measured steps. Loretta began running water into the sink, the familiar routine of Sunday cleanup providing a steady rhythm to hold on to. Steam rose from the faucet, clouding the window above where her plants still reached toward the fading daylight. She heard Dominique's heels click deliberately across the tile floor, stopping just behind her. "Loretta," Dominique began, her voice carrying the practiced patience of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "We need to discuss something important. About the house." Loretta turned off the water but didn't turn around. "The house?" "Yes. Calvin and I have been talking." Dominique moved to lean against the counter, positioning herself in Loretta's line of sight. Her designer dress seemed to absorb the kitchen's warm light, making her look oddly formal against the familiar backdrop of family dinners and birthday cakes. "We've decided this house would be the perfect solution to our space problem." The steam from the sink dissipated slowly as Dominique continued, her words flowing with practiced precision. "The children need more room. The school district here is better. It just makes sense for us to move in." She paused, offering what might have been meant as a generous smile. "You'd be welcome to stay, of course. The back bedroom would be perfect for you." Loretta dried her hands on a dish towel, each movement deliberate. The back bedroom, where she stored old photo albums and Calvin's childhood art projects, where the morning sun barely reached through the small window. She turned to face her daughter-in-law fully. "Let me ask you something," Loretta said, her voice quiet but clear. "Whose name is on this deed?" Something flickered across Dominique's carefully composed expression. A crack in the veneer, quickly masked. She straightened, switching tactics with the smoothness of someone who had prepared multiple approaches. "You know, Loretta, I've been thinking about everything we've done for you." Dominique's voice took on a new edge. "Remember when I picked up the kids twice last month when you couldn't manage it? And that grocery run I did for you back in March?" She began pacing the kitchen, her heels marking each point like punctuation. "The birthday dinner at that nice restaurant downtown, the one you barely seem to appreciate. After everything we've done, after all the ways we've tried to help you adjust to retirement." Her voice climbed higher with each example, the catalog of perceived debts spooling out between them. Movement in the kitchen doorway caught Loretta's attention. Calvin stood there, his face transforming as he processed his wife's words. This wasn't the conversation he'd been told would happen. That much was clear in the way his hands clenched at his sides, in the sudden straightening of his spine. He took a step forward, mouth opening to speak, but Dominique moved faster. The sound of the slap cracked through the kitchen like summer lightning, sharp, sudden, and leaving stunned silence in its wake. Loretta's head turned with the force of it, her cheek blazing where Dominique's open hand had connected. The silence held for one heartbeat, two, then shattered as Dominique thrust her hand out, palm up, demanding, "Give me your house keys." Her voice vibrated with adrenaline. Whatever calculation had governed her earlier speech burned away by the moment's violence. We're adding our names to this deed by the end of the month. Calvin's voice came low and dangerous from the doorway. Dominique! It was a tone Loretta had never heard from her son, something protective and horrified all at once. He moved between them, his back to his mother, shielding her from his wife's outstretched hand. We're leaving, he said firmly. Now. Dominique's hand remained extended, trembling slightly now. Calvin. Now. He didn't raise his voice, but the word carried the weight of something final. The house keys lay on the counter where Dominique had demanded them, untouched. Calvin didn't look at them as he guided his wife toward the door. Didn't reach for them even once. Loretta walked steadily to her bedroom, closed the door with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden emptiness of the house. She sat on the edge of her bed, perfectly still in the gathering darkness. Her cheek burned with the outline of Dominique's hand, but her own hands, folded in her lap, were absolutely steady. In the darkened bedroom, Loretta sat perfectly still on the edge of her mattress, her hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl waiting for assembly to begin. The house around her held its familiar evening sounds, the gentle hum of the heating system, the tick of the hallway clock she'd bought at that antique store in '96, the distant whisper of traffic beyond her garden. But something had shifted, like a painting knocked slightly off center, changing everything while moving nothing at all. Her cheek still burned, not just from the slap, though that heat lingered, a perfect outline of Dominique's hand, but from the humiliation intended behind it. The casual certainty that Loretta could be struck in her own kitchen, beside the windowsill where her plants had grown for a decade, and simply accept it as her new reality. Through the wall, she could hear them still in her living room. Dominique's voice had taken on a different tone now, something conciliatory and careful, as though trying to smooth over a minor social faux pas rather than an assault. Calvin's responses came shorter, clipped. They were arguing, but quietly, the way people argue when they're trying to maintain the fiction that nothing irreparable has happened. Loretta's hand moved to her phone, resting beside her on the quilted bedspread her grandmother had made. She had numbers she could call. Paulette, who would be here in 15 minutes with righteous anger and unwavering support. June, her sister, who would try to mediate, to smooth things over, to find some middle ground that didn't exist. But neither of those calls would address what had actually happened in her kitchen. Instead, her fingers moved with perfect certainty to a number she'd never called before, though it had been offered many times. Detective Raymond Okafor answered on the second ring, his voice professional but warm with recognition. Mrs. Washington? Raymond, Loretta said, her voice steady as a foundation wall. I need you to come to my house. My daughter-in-law just assaulted me in my kitchen, and she's still in my living room demanding my house keys. She heard the immediate shift in his breathing, the rustle of movement. Are you safe right now? Are you somewhere secure? I'm in my bedroom. The door is closed. I can hear them in the living room. I'm already moving. My partner and I will be there in minutes. Stay on the line with me. Loretta did, listening to the sound of a car engine starting, the brief crackle of a radio. She answered his questions with precise clarity. Yes, it was an open-handed slap. Yes, there were demands made. No, this was not the first indication of escalating behavior. He didn't interrupt, didn't minimize, didn't suggest she was overreacting. He just gathered information with the efficiency of someone who understood exactly what this call meant coming from this woman. True to his word, she heard sirens in exactly 11 minutes. The sound of police at her door, Raymond's firm knock, his clear announcement, seemed to shock something in the living room into silence. Loretta rose from her bed, straightened her blouse, and walked down her hallway with measured steps. She found Dominique standing in the center of the room, designer bag still on her shoulder, staring at the door as though it might somehow open onto a different reality than the one she'd created. Calvin stood slightly apart from his wife, his face set in lines Loretta had never seen before. When Raymond entered with his partner, Dominique's composure cracked completely. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice climbing. "This is a family matter. This is between us. Raymond, you know better than to get involved in family matters." Raymond remained professionally neutral as his partner began reading rights. "Ma'am, assault is assault, regardless of relation. Please put your bag down and place your hands behind your back. Dominique turned to Calvin, her eyes wide with disbelief. Are you going to let this happen? They're arresting me over nothing. Over a family disagreement. Calvin looked at his wife, then at his mother, then back at Dominique. His voice came quiet, but clear. You hit my mother. The handcuffs clicked shut. Dominique's protests continued all the way to the patrol car, her voice carrying across the front yard Loretta had tended for 30 years. Calvin watched them lead her away, then turned to his mother. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. Without a word, he picked up his keys and left, heading not to the station, but to his cousin's apartment across town. Loretta stood on her porch in the gathering dark, watching the patrol car's lights fade into the distance. The night air carried the scent of her gardenia bushes, planted the year she bought this house, now thick and healthy along the walkway. When the street was quiet again, she went inside, her steps unhurried. The house keys still lay on the kitchen counter where Dominique had demanded them. Loretta picked them up, felt their familiar weight in her palm, then walked to her front door and turned each lock with deliberate care. In the quiet of her kitchen, illuminated only by the pendant light above her table, Loretta settled into her usual chair. Her reading glasses perched on her nose, yellow legal pad pristine before her, laptop humming to life. The digital clock on her oven read 11:42 p.m. She flexed her fingers and picked up her pen. First, the financial records. Loretta logged into her online banking with the careful precision that had guided her through 31 years of administrative work. She created columns on her pad. Dates, amounts, patterns. The changed locks last month hadn't been a contractor's mistake. She found the charge from a locksmith she'd never authorized on a credit card she shared with Calvin for emergencies. $300. She wrote it down, drew a neat star beside it. Next, the calendar. Loretta pulled up her Google Calendar, the one she'd maintained meticulously since retirement to give structure to her days. She began noting the pattern of canceled Sunday dinners, each one preceded by a text from Dominique about Calvin working late or the children being sick. The excuses seemed reasonable in isolation. Listed chronologically, they formed a clear strategy of isolation. The babysitting schedule told its own story. What had started as 3 reliable days each week had become increasingly erratic. Dominique would text last-minute changes, saying she'd decided to work from home or found alternative care. Each change was presented as a favor to Loretta, giving her a break, letting her rest, while simultaneously reducing her time with the grandchildren. Phone records painted perhaps the clearest picture. Loretta downloaded 6 months of Calvin's call logs from their family plan. His calls to her had dropped from daily to weekly, then bi-weekly. Almost every abbreviated conversation showed Dominique's number calling him within minutes of hanging up with his mother. The kitchen clock ticked past 2 a.m. Loretta made herself a cup of chamomile tea, not because she needed sleep, but because the routine of it helped her think. She returned to her notes, adding new columns, drawing connections. The house itself had become Dominique's increasing focus. Comments about the space, about improvements needed, about how perfect it would be for the children. Each suggestion carrying the weight of future ownership, as though Loretta's home was already transitioning to their possession without her consent. 3 a.m. brought the subtle patterns into sharp relief. How Dominique had gradually positioned herself between Loretta and every family decision. How she'd reframed Loretta's independence as stubbornness, her standards as rigidity, her desire to maintain her home as selfishness. The narrative had been crafted so carefully that even Calvin had begun to accept it. By 4 a.m, Loretta had filled 4 pages with neat, precise handwriting. The timeline sprawled across the yellow paper like architectural drawings, revealing the foundation of something deliberate and calculated. This was not a daughter-in-law's impulsive response to frustration. This was a campaign, executed with patience and precision, that had begun almost from the moment Dominique entered their lives. Loretta made coffee at 7:30, showered and dressed in a pressed blouse and slacks. At exactly 8 a.m. she called Beverly Osei Mensah. Beverly answered on the first ring. "I saw the docket this morning," Beverly said, bypassing hello. "Are you all right?" "I need to come to your office," Loretta replied. "But first, I need to ask you something. Has Dominique ever contacted you professionally?" The pause on the other end of the line carried weight. 14 months ago, Beverly said finally, a woman came to my office. She didn't give her name, but she matched your daughter-in-law's description exactly. She had very specific questions about contesting wills and adding names to property deeds. She wanted to know what constituted diminished capacity in a parent, and how adult children could petition for property control if they could prove cognitive decline. Loretta's pen moved across the paper, circling this information twice. What did you tell her? I refused the consultation. Without names, without direct evidence of intent, I couldn't report it. But I remembered it, Loretta. I remembered every detail. Loretta closed her first legal pad and pulled a fresh one from her desk drawer. Her handwriting remained steady as she wrote the date at the top of the new page. This was no longer a domestic incident to be smoothed over with apologies and compromises. This was a documented campaign of isolation, manipulation, and attempted property theft. She had only begun to understand its architecture, but she understood enough to know exactly what needed to happen next. At precisely 9 a.m., Loretta called Paulette. Her friend answered immediately, her voice tight with concern. I've been waiting to hear from you since I saw what happened, Paulette said. Are you okay? I need to ask you something direct, Loretta replied, her tone measured. What do you know that you haven't told me? The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. When Paulette spoke again, her voice was heavy with something that sounded like guilt mixed with relief. I have a recording, she said finally, from the 4th of July cookout last year. I wasn't trying to spy. I was just sitting there with my phone in my lap, taking pictures of the grandkids. But I caught something I didn't know what to do with. Loretta's pen hovered over her legal pad. Tell me. Dominique was talking to Marcus's new wife. You remember? They were sitting by the flower beds? She didn't know I was recording. She told her that your house was basically theirs already, that it was just a matter of time. Said you were too proud to just hand it over, but that she had a plan to handle that. Loretta wrote this down in her precise handwriting. Do you still have the recording? Of course I do. I kept it because something felt wrong. But I didn't know if I was overreacting. I didn't want to cause problems if I was reading too much into it. Paulette's voice cracked slightly. I should have told you sooner. You're telling me now, Loretta said simply. Can you send it to me? Right now. Give me 2 minutes. While waiting for the file, Loretta added the date of the cookout to her timeline. 18 months ago. Before the changed locks. Before the canceled dinners. Before everything else she'd documented through the night. Her phone chimed with the incoming file. The recording was clear. Background noise from the party, children laughing, and Dominique's voice, casual and confident. It's a perfect house for us, really. 4 bedrooms, that beautiful yard. Loretta's too proud to just sign it over. You know how older people get about their independence. But we have a plan. It'll be ours by the end of the year, one way or another. Loretta played it 3 times, transcribing every word. Then she got dressed and drove to her grandchildren's elementary school. Ms. Thompson, her granddaughter's first-grade teacher, welcomed her warmly into the classroom during lunch break. The children miss seeing you, she said, settling into her desk chair. They used to talk about Grandma's house all the time. Loretta's pen stilled on her notepad. What did they say about my house? Oh, they've been so excited about moving there, Ms. Thompson said brightly. For months now, they've been telling their classmates it's going to be their new home. Sarah even drew a picture of it last week in art class, labeled it our new house. I thought you knew about the move. When did they start talking about this? Ms. Thompson thought for a moment. I'd say around January. They were very specific about which bedroom would be theirs. Sarah said she was getting your sewing room. Loretta thanked her and left, each step measured and deliberate. Instead of driving home, she took the familiar route to Calvin and Dominique's rental property. The for lease sign stood stark against the late morning sun. New, clean, professionally installed. Loretta parked and walked closer, noting the contact information. She called the property management company from her car. Yes, that unit, the agent confirmed cheerfully. Available May 1st. The current tenants gave notice 2 weeks ago. Are you interested in viewing? 2 weeks ago. Before the confrontation. Before the slap. Before the demand for keys. They had already surrendered their lease, certain they would be living in her house by May. Loretta sat in her parked car, looking at the sign, the pieces aligned with devastating clarity. The slap hadn't been a loss of control. It had been impatience, a crack in the careful execution of a plan that was already in motion. They had given notice. They had told the children. They had prepared everything except Loretta's consent, which they had assumed they could force when the time came. She drove home in silence, the morning traffic flowing around her like water. In her kitchen, she opened her legal pad and made 3 new entries in her precise handwriting. 1. July 4th recording. Dominique to Marcus's wife. 2. Children discussing move at school since January 3rd. Rental notice given April 1st, 2 weeks before confrontation. The next morning, Loretta's phone rang at exactly 8:15 a.m. Beverly's name lit up the screen. "You need to hear this," Beverly said without preamble. "My investigator found something." "Are you sitting down?" Loretta settled into her kitchen chair, legal pad ready. "I am now. We found the document preparer, strip mall operation on Madison Avenue, calls himself a legal documentation specialist. He's been dancing on the edge of unauthorized practice of law for years." Beverly's voice was controlled but tight with urgency. "He drafted a quitclaim deed for Dominique 3 months ago. Your name is on it as the grantor." Loretta's pen stilled on the paper. "My signature? Forged. Badly, I might add. The document was never filed with the county recorder's office, which is the only piece of good luck in this whole mess. My guess is she was holding it in reserve, planning to use the confrontation to force you into voluntary compliance first. The forced transfer would have been Plan B." Loretta wrote, "Fraudulent deed, prepared 3 months ago." Her handwriting remained steady. "Do we have proof?" "Better than proof. We have a terrified document preparer who doesn't want to be an accessory to deed fraud. He's already provided a written statement detailing every meeting, every email, every draft. He's practically tripping over himself to cooperate." Beverly paused. "Loretta, this changes everything. This isn't just assault anymore. This is attempted property theft by deception, conspiracy to commit deed fraud, and forgery. I'm filing reports with the county recorder's office and the district attorney this afternoon. What do you need from me?" "Nothing yet. Let me handle the legal mechanics. But Loretta..." Beverly's voice softened slightly. "This was premeditated, carefully planned. She spent months putting this together." "I know," Loretta said quietly. "Add it to the file." After hanging up, Loretta sat at her kitchen table for a long moment, adding details to her timeline. The deed draft predated the lease termination. The lease termination predated the confrontation. Every piece had been arranged like dominoes, waiting for the final push. The doorbell rang at 7:45 that evening. Through the window, Loretta saw Calvin standing on her porch, holding a manila folder. His shoulders were curved inward, not with guilt, but with the weight of discovery. When she opened the door, she really looked at him, past the surface tension to something deeper. She recognized it immediately. The specific way a person holds themselves when the floor has vanished beneath their feet, but they're still somehow standing. She had felt it herself 4 days ago in this same doorway. "Can I come in?" he asked. His voice was hoarse, as though he'd been talking for hours or not talking at all. Loretta stepped aside, letting him enter the house he grew up in. He moved to the kitchen automatically, their old pattern, their familiar space, and sat heavily at the table. "I've been at Marcus's place," he said, placing the folder between them. "Going through everything." Her laptop was still unlocked when she left that night. "I started looking because I needed to understand. I kept looking because I couldn't stop finding things." He opened the folder with careful fingers. Inside, printed emails between Dominique and the document preparer, discussing formatting requirements for deed transfers. Screenshots of text conversations with a friend where Dominique described Loretta as the last obstacle, and detailed plans for renovating specific rooms. A saved draft of the quitclaim deed with Loretta's forged signature. "There's more," Calvin said quietly. "So much more. Bank statements, messages about selling the furniture you inherited from Grandma May, plans for the garden, for my old room, for everything." She had it all mapped out, room by room, month by month. He looked up at his mother, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "She was going to take everything you built." Loretta reached for the papers with steady hands, scanning dates, details, confirmations of everything Beverly had uncovered and more. Her son had found it all independently, driven by the same need for truth that had kept her at this table that first night with her legal pad. "I didn't call a lawyer first," Calvin said. "I didn't talk to anyone. I came straight here because you needed to see it yourself, because I needed you to know that I found it myself." His voice cracked slightly. "Because I needed you to know that once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it." Loretta rose and made a fresh pot of coffee. Some conversations required fuel, and this would be one of them. The familiar ritual, measuring grounds, adding water, waiting for the first drips, gave her hands something steady to do while her mind processed what Calvin had brought her. When she returned to the table with 2 mugs, Calvin had spread the documents in careful chronological order. His organizational instinct matched hers, a trait she'd passed down without realizing it until now. "Start at the beginning," Loretta said, settling into her chair. "Tell me what you found." Calvin pulled out a series of text messages dated 3 years ago. It started small. "Dominique would mention things you supposedly said when I wasn't around. Comments about our parenting, complaints about how often we visited. I'd ask her why you didn't tell me directly, and she'd say you were too proud to address things with me." He rubbed his eyes. "When I look at it now, there's no proof you ever said any of it. But at the time..." Loretta nodded, adding notes to her pad. "Go on." "The phone calls were next. She'd answer when you called, tell you I was busy, then tell me later you'd only asked about housework or complained about something minor. She'd say things like, 'Your mother's just having a hard time letting go,' or 'She needs to understand we have our own life now.'" Calvin's voice caught. "I started avoiding calls because I thought every conversation would be difficult, but they were only difficult because she was making them difficult," Loretta finished quietly. They worked through the timeline methodically. Loretta showed Calvin her notes about the changed locks, the cooling holiday gatherings, the gradual reduction in grandchild visits. Calvin matched each with messages or emails showing how Dominique had engineered each distance, each misunderstanding, each small separation. "The house fixation was constant," Calvin said, pulling out more papers. "She'd mention renovations she wanted to do here, changes she planned to make. When I'd say this wasn't our house to change, she'd talk about how you were getting older, how you couldn't manage it alone, how we needed to be realistic about the future." He looked around the immaculate kitchen. "But you were managing fine. Better than fine." While reviewing bank statements, Loretta noticed something in her joint emergency account records. An account she'd added Calvin to years ago for genuine crises. Small transfers, spaced irregularly, $200 here, $350 there, $175 somewhere else. She began adding them up. "Calvin," she said carefully, "did you make any withdrawals from the emergency account in the past 14 months? He shook his head. "I haven't touched that account since you added me." "Why?" Loretta showed him the statement. "Someone transferred $11,000 out in small amounts, to an account I don't recognize." Calvin's face went pale. He pulled out his phone, checking his own banking records. "She had my login information. I gave it to her last year when she offered to handle a bill payment while I was traveling for work." He looked up. "I never changed it." Loretta picked up her phone and dialed Beverly's number. The attorney answered on the first ring. "Beverly, I need you to add something to the DA's complaint," Loretta said, her voice steady. "We just found evidence of elder financial exploitation. 14 months of unauthorized transfers totaling $11,000. I have the bank records in front of me, and Calvin is confirming he never authorized or received any of these transfers." "That's a separate felony charge," Beverly replied instantly. "I'll file an amended complaint this afternoon." This strengthens the premeditation argument significantly. After hanging up, Loretta looked at her son across the table, really looked at him. He was exhausted, shoulders heavy with 4 days of revelation, but his eyes were clear. The fog had lifted. "I need one thing from you," she said finally. "The truth. On the record. To Beverly. To the DA. To whoever needs to hear it. No minimizing, no protecting, just what happened and what you found." Calvin met her gaze directly. "I'll be at Beverly's office at 8 a.m. tomorrow." The kitchen clock ticked steadily in the silence between them. Outside, the sun was setting on another day in the house Loretta had built, the house that stood exactly as she had made it, protected now by truth laid bare across her kitchen table. 3 weeks after Dominique's arrest, Loretta's kitchen held the familiar scent of fresh coffee and the unfamiliar weight of truth waiting to be told. She adjusted the collar of her cream blazer, the same one she'd worn to countless school board meetings when difficult things needed saying, and checked the array of documents laid out on the table one final time. Calvin stood at the counter, arranging coffee cups with the careful precision of someone grateful for a task. He'd arrived early, carrying additional copies of everything they'd discovered, organized in folders with the same methodical attention his mother had taught him through example rather than instruction. "They're here," he said quietly, glancing through the window as June's car pulled into the driveway. Patricia's sedan parked behind it. Loretta nodded, straightening papers that didn't need straightening. "Let them settle before we start." The doorbell rang, and Calvin moved to answer it. June entered first, her usual warm smile replaced by uncertain tension. Patricia followed, carrying herself with the rigid posture of someone braced for impact. Both women stopped short at the sight of the kitchen table, not because of the documents spread across it, but because of how Calvin and Loretta were positioned. Mother and son sat together on one side, a united front where they'd expected division. The visual alone shifted something in the air. June's shoulders dropped slightly. Patricia's hands tightened on her purse. "Please, sit," Loretta said, gesturing to the chairs across from them. "The coffee's fresh." Calvin poured for everyone, the quiet domestic action grounding the moment. Steam rose from 4 identical mugs, carrying the scent of routine into a conversation that would be anything but routine. "I'd like to speak first, if that's all right," Calvin said, his voice steady. He wasn't performing anger or seeking sympathy. He was simply there to establish facts. Loretta nodded, and Calvin opened the first folder. 3 days after the arrest, I went through Dominique's laptop, which she left unlocked when she was taken into custody. I found emails between her and a document preparer discussing how to forge Mom's signature. I found saved drafts of a quitclaim deed with Mom's name copied onto it. I found text messages describing Mom as the last obstacle to getting this house. He passed copies across the table, each page marked with yellow tabs indicating key passages. June's hands shook slightly as she accepted the papers. Patricia remained perfectly still, her coffee untouched. "I brought everything to Mom immediately," Calvin continued. "Not to an attorney first, not to anyone else. To her. Because she deserved to know exactly what had been happening in her own home." He sat back, yielding the floor. Loretta opened her own folders. "What Calvin discovered confirmed what I had begun to suspect," she said, her voice carrying the same measured tone she'd used in 3 decades of administrative meetings. But there was more. She laid out the evidence methodically. Beverly's account of Dominique's will contest inquiry 14 months ago, Paulette's recording from the family cookout, the financial records showing $11,000 in unauthorized transfers, the for lease sign posted before Dominique ever confronted her. "Your grandchildren's teacher told me they'd been announcing to their class for months that they were moving into Grandma's house," Loretta said, looking directly at Patricia. "They were told this was decided before I ever knew about it." June made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "Loretta, all those times I told you were being too sensitive, too suspicious, too proud," Loretta finished quietly. "Too difficult to get along with." "I'm so sorry," June whispered, tears falling freely now. "I should have listened. I should have seen." Patricia hadn't moved, hadn't touched the documents, hadn't sipped her coffee. She sat staring at the evidence of her daughter's actions spread across Loretta's kitchen table. "Dominique?" she said finally, her daughter's name coming out like a question she already knew the devastating answer to. Her composure cracked, eyes filling. Calvin reached for the tissue box without comment and set it beside her. The small gesture, practical, compassionate, uncomplicated, seemed to break something loose in Patricia. She took a tissue with trembling fingers and pressed it to her eyes. The meeting concluded naturally, without need for dramatic declarations. June and Patricia gathered their copies of the documents. No one tried to defend the indefensible. No one asked for leniency or understanding. The truth had weight enough without commentary. After they left, Calvin stood at the sink washing coffee cups while Loretta remained at the table. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The silence between them was comfortable now. The quiet of two people who had faced something enormous together and emerged on the same side, not just of a table, but of understanding. The county courthouse stood solid and square against the morning sky, its brick facade nearly the same color as Loretta's home. She adjusted her navy suit jacket, different from the cream blazer of the family meeting, chosen specifically for this moment, and climbed the steps beside Calvin, who carried a leather portfolio containing copies of everything they'd already submitted to the DA's office. Inside, Dominique's private attorney paced the hallway, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the standard-issue blazer worn by the assistant district attorney who stood calmly reviewing files nearby. The defense attorney had spent the past week attempting to negotiate the charges down to simple assault and time served. The DA's office, armed with Beverly's meticulous documentation and Calvin's cooperative testimony, had declined. Mrs. Washington, Dominique's attorney approached, his tone carefully modulated. Perhaps we could discuss. Any communication needs to go through Beverly, Loretta interrupted quietly, not breaking stride. Beverly, waiting by the courtroom doors, moved to intercept the attorney with practiced efficiency. The preliminary hearing proceeded with the measured pace of justice being carefully served. Dominique sat at the defense table in tailored clothing that couldn't quite disguise the strain of 3 weeks in county custody. Her attorney presented her as a misunderstood daughter-in-law caught in family tension that had escalated regrettably. The DA methodically dismantled this narrative with exhibits: the forged deed draft, the document preparer's sworn statement, the financial records showing systematic theft, Paulette's recording establishing premeditation. Each piece laid bare the architecture of calculation behind the single impulsive act of violence. When Calvin took the stand as a cooperating witness, Dominique's attorney attempted to paint him as a vengeful husband seeking retribution for a failing marriage. "Isn't it true," the attorney pressed, "that you only came forward with these allegations after your wife was arrested?" "I came forward," Calvin replied evenly, "when I found evidence that my wife had attempted to steal my mother's home through fraud and forgery. The documents are dated. The timeline is clear. And you expect us to believe you knew nothing about this beforehand?" "I expect the evidence to speak for itself," Calvin said. "The forged deed draft was on my wife's laptop. The unauthorized transfers were from my mother's account. These are documented facts." The attorney tried several more angles, but Calvin's testimony remained steady. Not emotional, not defensive, simply accurate. When asked about his marriage, he answered without hesitation, "I filed for divorce because I discovered my wife had systematically deceived both me and my mother while attempting to steal her home. That's not revenge. That's consequence." Dominique was convicted on the assault charge with little deliberation. Faced with the weight of evidence on the fraud conspiracy count, she accepted a plea deal, 18 months in county jail for the assault, plus 5 years probation and mandatory full restitution of the stolen $11,000. At the sentencing hearing, Loretta rose when called to deliver her victim impact statement. She carried a single sheet of paper, though she'd memorized every word. The courtroom was quiet as she began. "I purchased my home 27 years ago," she said, her voice clear and measured. "I built my career over 31 years in public education. I raised my son alone, saved carefully, and paid off my mortgage early. I maintained my property, built my own bookshelves, tended my own garden. Everything I own, I earned through work and choice." She paused briefly, but not for effect, simply to maintain precision. "The defendant spent 14 months attempting to take not just my home but my dignity. She constructed a narrative of my irrelevance. She isolated my son. She stole my money in small amounts, believing I wouldn't notice or wouldn't matter if I did. She prepared forged documents and planned to invalidate my autonomy, all while sitting at my table and accepting my care of her children." Loretta's voice remained steady, neither rising in anger nor falling into grief. "I want the record to reflect that I am not here because I was broken. I am here because I was not." The courtroom held its silence as Loretta gathered her papers. She did not look at Dominique. She did not need to. She stood, straight-backed and certain, and walked out beside her son. The heavy doors closed behind them with the quiet finality of truth properly told. The week after sentencing, Loretta sat at her kitchen table with Beverly, reviewing the updated will. Sunlight streamed through the window, highlighting the empty flower box outside, a small detail she'd neglected during the months of documentation and hearings. "The revocable trust gives you complete control," Beverly explained, tapping the papers with her pen. "The conditions are clear. No contests, no claims of diminished capacity, no attempts to alter the deed. Any violation voids inheritance rights immediately." Loretta nodded, signing where indicated. The papers felt solid under her hand like the brick walls around them. "Thank you, Beverly. For everything." "You did the hard work," Beverly replied, gathering the documents. "I just provided the proper channels." After Beverly left, Loretta called Marcus, the locksmith who'd maintained her doors for 20 years. He arrived within the hour, changing every lock with careful efficiency while sharing stories about his grandchildren's latest achievements. The familiar rhythm of neighborhood connection felt like stepping back into her own life. That afternoon, she drove to the garden center. The woman behind the counter remembered her from previous springs and helped her select purple petunias and trailing vinca for the window box. The soil felt cool and vital between her fingers as she planted, a simple act of moving forward. Paulette arrived for dinner just as the sun began its descent. They carried their plates to the back porch, grilled chicken, fresh bread, summer vegetables, and settled into the comfortable chairs Loretta had restored herself the previous summer. "The flowers look good," Paulette noted, gesturing toward the window box. "It was time," Loretta replied simply. They talked easily as darkness gathered, about Paulette's upcoming cruise, about the school district's latest curriculum changes, about nothing in particular. The conversation rambled naturally, punctuated by crickets and distant wind chimes. For the first time in what felt like years, Loretta wasn't managing a crisis or documenting a timeline. She was simply sitting in her garden with her friend, watching evening arrive. 18 months flowed past like water finding its proper course. Loretta's consulting business grew organically. First one struggling district seeking curriculum guidance, then another needing administrative restructuring. Her phone began ringing with referrals from former colleagues who remembered her steady competence. She found herself earning more than her final administrative salary, working hours she chose, solving problems that genuinely engaged her mind. Calvin's divorce proceeded without drama. He found an apartment 10 minutes away, in the neighborhood where he'd grown up. He called regularly, Tuesday evenings and Saturday mornings like clockwork, not from obligation, but from choice. When Loretta mentioned the sticking back gate, he arrived the next morning with tools and spent 2 hours making it swing true again. Sunday dinners resumed gradually, then settled into routine. Calvin brought the children, who filled the brick house with the particular chaos of young lives finding their footing. Patricia facilitated the arrangements quietly, understanding completely that her grandchildren shouldn't lose their grandmother because of their mother's choices. She and Loretta had one brief direct conversation about it, sufficient and honest. They weren't friends, but they were women who respected what the other was trying to protect. 8 months into her sentence, Dominique existed only in paperwork and necessary legal communications. The life she'd planned to step into, Loretta's home, Loretta's stability, Loretta's carefully built equity, had dissolved like smoke. The rental house was relet within 2 weeks of their departure. There was no fund, no fallback, no version of the plan that survived contact with truth. The relationship between Loretta and Calvin grew into something different than before, not built on sentiment or obligation, but on demonstrated honesty under the hardest possible pressure. They had seen each other clearly in crisis, and neither had looked away. That created a sturdier foundation than what existed before. On a bright Saturday morning, Loretta sat at her kitchen table, the sweet potato pound cake filling the house with familiar warmth. A new legal pad lay open before her, not for evidence this time, but for plans. Consulting proposals drafted in her precise handwriting, a list of districts she hadn't reached yet, a note to call Beverly about routine matters, forward-facing things, normal things. From the living room, Calvin's voice. "Ma, your timer went off." She was already standing. "Thank you for watching until the end. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I've got 2 stories on the screen that you have to watch next. Have a great day."